in a few inches of water, in a shallow ditch on an Arizona reservation. A 32-year-old man lies face down. It's January 1955. No one finds him until morning. 10 years earlier, his hands were among the first ones reaching for a flagpole in the most reproduced photograph in American history, the flag raising on Iwo Jima. 3 of the men who raised that flag beside him were dead within days. He would spend the next 10 years wishing. Some who knew him said that he'd been the 4th. His name was Ira Hayes. The country that needed his face never quite figured out what to do with the man underneath it. Ira Hayes was born in 1923 on the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona, a member of the Pima tribe. His parents kept an American flag displayed in their home. The government they displayed it for did not yet fully recognize them as citizens of the country whose flag it was. Arizona would not let Native Americans vote until 1948. 3 years after the war that made Hayes famous had already ended. He grew up quiet. People who knew him described a boy who could sit in a room for hours without saying a word and who read constantly when he did. In August 1942, at 19, he enlisted in the Marine Corps. He volunteered for paratrooper training and became the first Pima in history to earn jump wings. His fellow Marines gave him a nickname, Chief Falling Cloud. Back on the reservation, people were proud. One relative later said simply that he made them proud to be Pima. None of that pride would survive what came next entirely intact. Hayes shipped out to the Pacific in 1943, fighting first at Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. It was brutal jungle warfare, but it was not what would define him. In February 1945, his division landed on a 5-mile volcanic island called Iwo Jima. It would become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Over 6,000 Americans killed before it was over. On February 23rd, 4 days into the invasion, Marines reached the top of Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano overlooking the beach. A small flag went up first, more functional than symbolic, a signal to the fleet that the summit was taken. An officer decided it was too small to be seen properly and ordered a larger one sent up. Hayes was part of the patrol that carried the second, larger flag to the top. What happened next took perhaps 20 seconds. 6 men, 5 Marines, and a Navy corpsman grabbed a length of pipe tied on the larger flag and pushed it upright against the wind. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, arriving just in time, swung his camera up and caught the moment without even fully framing the shot through his viewfinder. He didn't know, in that instant, whether he'd captured anything usable at all. He had captured, instead, the most reproduced photograph of the 20th century. Hayes is on the far left of the frame, both hands stretched upward, his face not visible. He would spend years being asked to confirm he was the man in a photograph where you couldn't even see his face. The battle for Iwo Jima did not end when the photograph was taken. It had barely begun. Of the 6 men in that frame, 3 were dead within days, killed in the fighting that continued for another month across the island. Franklin Sousley, Harlan Block, and Michael Strank did not live to see the photograph become famous. Hayes did. He fought through the rest of the campaign and survived a battle that killed roughly a third of the Marines who served in it. He came home from Iwo Jima. The 3 men beside him in the photograph did not. That fact would sit at the center of everything that happened to him for the rest of his life. The photograph reached American newspapers within days, and the government understood immediately what it had. The war was in its final, exhausting stretch. War bond sales were slipping. The public needed something to believe in again. Someone in Washington decided that 3 of the surviving flag raisers should be brought home to headline a war bond tour. Hayes was one of them. He did not want to go. According to people who served with him, he tried to avoid being identified at all, hoping the request would simply pass him by. His commanding officers eventually found out who he was and ordered him to participate anyway. In April 1945, Ira Hayes stood in the White House and shook the hand of President Harry Truman. He had not asked for any of this. It happened to him anyway, the way weather happens to a man standing outside. There was a specific reason the government wanted Hayes on that bond tour, beyond simply having a survivor to parade. A Native American Marine, standing beside 2 white Marines in the same iconic photograph, made a particular kind of propaganda point about a unified American war effort. The country that would not let his own reservation vote until 1948 was, in 1945, actively using his identity as proof of that unity. He was not naive about this. People who worked with him during the tour described him as sullen, uncomfortable, aware that something about the arrangement did not add up. He was being asked to represent an inclusion his own daily life did not remotely reflect. No one on the tour circuit seemed especially interested in resolving that contradiction. They mostly just needed him to stand where the cameras could see him. The Bond tour required him to appear at rallies across the country, to be introduced as a hero, to smile for photographs recreating the moment that had already made him famous. Without his permission, He struggled with it visibly. Reporters at the time noted he seemed uncomfortable in front of crowds, saying little, drinking more. He was not being asked to be a Marine anymore. He was being asked to be a symbol, indefinitely, of a moment that had already cost the lives of men he'd fought beside. Symbols don't get to have bad days. Symbols don't get to grieve in public. Hayes was expected to be both, permanently, the moment the photograph made him famous. He returned to his unit before the tour even finished. The Marine Corps sent him back to finish the war as a soldier, not a mascot. It was, by most accounts, a relief. The war ended. Hayes was honorably discharged in December 1945 and went home to the Gila River Reservation. Home had not changed. The reservation was still poor. Farming the arid Pima land was still difficult, made harder by decades of upstream water diversion that had crippled traditional Pima agriculture long before Hayes was born. Fame, it turned out, did not translate into anything the reservation could use. Job offers came in from outside, but many required him to essentially perform being the flag raiser. Public appearances, ceremonies, more photographs. He took some of the jobs. He struggled to keep most of them. He began drinking heavily, and it did not let up. Over the following years, he was arrested for public intoxication dozens of times. Accounts place the number as high as 52. Whatever this behavior was called at the time, it looked very much like what a later generation would recognize immediately as post-traumatic stress. Around 1946, Hayes became fixated on a specific injustice, one he could actually do something about. Unlike his own fame, the Marine Corps had officially identified one of the men in the photograph as a sergeant named Hank Hansen. Hayes knew this was wrong. The man in that position in the photograph was Harlan Block, one of the three who died on Iwo Jima weeks after the picture was taken. Nobody with authority seemed interested in correcting the record for a dead Marine's family. So Hayes decided to correct it himself. He made his way from Arizona to Texas, hitchhiking most of the roughly 1,300 miles to reach the Block family home in person. He was not asked to do this. No officer ordered it. It was, in a life increasingly directed by other people's demands, one of the only things Hayes did entirely on his own terms. The trip took him through small towns and open country over the course of weeks with little fanfare and no official backing. By the time he reached the Block family's home, he was not received as a celebrity making an appearance. He was simply a tired man who had come a very long way to correct a mistake that cost him nothing personally to leave uncorrected. Ada Block, Harlan's mother, had reportedly suspected for some time that the official identification was wrong. Hayes's account confirmed what she had already begun to believe on her own. When he arrived, he told her plainly her son was the man in the photograph, not Hansen. Harlan. The Marine Corps formally corrected the record the following year, in 1947. Hayes never publicized the trip himself. It surfaces in his biography mostly through the people who received him, not through anything he ever chose to say about it. Hayes had spent his own body crossing a state to give a grieving family back their son's place in history. No one performed a comparable act to give Hayes back anything of his own. In 1949, 3 years after that trip, he appeared briefly as himself in the John Wayne film Sands of Iwo Jima, a small, strange coda to a moment that had already outgrown his control of it. He was not consulted meaningfully on how his own story was told. He simply appeared in it, again, at someone else's request. The drinking continued. The arrests continued. He worked odd jobs, a handyman, briefly a chauffeur for the comedian Dean Martin, and struggled to hold most of them for long. Friends and family described a man who never fully returned from Iwo Jima, even as his body remained in Arizona for the following decade. He was quoted once saying he sometimes wished he'd never been in that photograph at all. It is one of the few direct lines historians have from Hayes himself about what the fame actually cost him. He rarely explained further. He mostly just kept drinking. On January 23, 1955, Hayes had been drinking with several other men on the reservation. What exactly happened that night has never been fully settled. His brothers would later suspect, without ever finding proof, that another man present had some responsibility for what happened. The official account is simpler and grimmer. Hayes drank, wandered off alone in the cold Arizona night, and collapsed. He was found the next morning, face down, in only a couple of inches of water in a shallow ditch, dead of exposure and alcohol poisoning. He was 32 years old, 10 years after Iwo Jima, 10 years after the White House, 10 years after walking 1,000 miles for another family's son. Ira Hayes died alone, a few hundred yards from the reservation he had tried, and largely failed, to leave behind. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, not far from some of the men whose war he'd fought. Within a decade, a songwriter named Peter Lafarge wrote a ballad about him, and Johnny Cash's recording of it made Ira Hayes more widely known in death than his own quiet life on the reservation had ever wanted him to be in it. The song does not flatter anyone. It does not pretend the country treated him well. It simply states, plainly, what happened to a man his country needed as an image and never quite figured out how to treat as a person. Hayes is remembered today at a small memorial park on the Gila River reservation that bears his name alongside a fellow Pima veterans. The photograph he appears in, hands raised, face turned away from the camera, remains one of the most reproduced images in American history. Almost everyone who has seen it could not identify him inside it. There is a version of Ira Hayes' story that ends at the White House, handshake secured, photograph secured in history, a hero's welcome home. That version stops in April 1945. It leaves out the other 10 years. What actually happened is that a country spent an afternoon deciding what a photograph meant, and spent no comparable effort deciding what it owed the men still living inside it. Hayes gave a grieving family back their son's name in that photograph on his own 2 feet at his own expense because no one else would. Nobody walked 32 years back into a shallow Arizona ditch to give Ira Hayes anything back at all. What do we actually owe someone once we decided they're a symbol of something bigger than themselves? And if the answer is more than a parade and a handshake, why does it so rarely arrive in time? Tell me what you think below. There's always another photograph with a face nobody quite remembers.